modest encroachments on privacy that are involved in getting phone numbers or duration without a name attached and not looking at content, that on net, it was worth us doing.
Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they aren't out to get you. The government is watching you, and we now know that for sure, thanks to the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal and the Guardian in the UK. Our government is tapping directly into the servers of some of the biggest tech companies in the world under the guise of looking for bad guys, foreign terrorism suspects. But we're all getting caught up in this digital dragnet. How's this going to affect the companies that have been outed? Will you still use their products and services? Is there a way to make money on any of this? Now, joining me now is Colonel Cedric Leighton, a former NAS official and a cybersecurity expert, and James Freeman, assistant editor of the Wall Street Journal. Thank you for being with us, gentlemen. And Colonel, let's start with you, because you NSA alumni always defend this and say, look, you don't understand, we're trying to keep you safe, and I appreciate the effort. But why is the net so vastly big as to take in all fish instead of going spearfishing for a couple of barracuda?
Dennis, I love the analogy. Here's the basic reason for that, and it's great to be with you, by the way. The NSA has a huge challenge in terms of actually finding data and finding the right kind of data. So obviously, a spearfishing type piece would be much more effective if you knew where to direct your spear. But if you don't know where to direct the spear, then it becomes a much harder problem, and you'll miss a lot of fish that you're going after. So that was NSA's philosophical and technical dilemma. So they had to find a way to do this, and the basic way that they did it was use data mining techniques to go after everything they could. And to do data mining effectively, the big idea was to find as much data as you possibly could and then pick the relevant pieces out of it. And that's why the program was developed as it was.
And do you personally think the NSA might have overreached here? I mean, are you okay with them looking at all your Google searches, every Google search you do when you're at home alone?
Well, quite frankly, I think that it's much better if they don't do that, if they don't look at everything that I do or that anybody else does for that matter. But the situation is this: the way it works in terms of going through this technically, they're dealing with a lot of external pieces of information. The internals would be the actual contents of the search, the actual phone conversation. In the case of the Verizon situation, so those are the things that they're looking at. They're looking at patterns of behavior,
gotcha.
Not necessarily the actual content of the message. If you want to go after the content of the message, then you have to have a special warrant for that.
Yeah, okay. And so James Freeman, Wall Street Journal, you're with the Wall Street Journal's editorial page.
Yes.
And I think it's one of the best in the world. I read it every single day. They came out with a rather passionate defense of the NSA and this entire mass digital dragnet. But you in your notes say that basically, as long as we're not looking at the content of the messages, the Supreme Court has long said we don't have the right to privacy to prevent that. But with the reports that came out from the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal and the news pages later, and they said that they are looking at live Google searches, they're looking at emails and video chats. That's a lot more than just a record of a phone call to a number and how long it lasted. Do you have a problem with that?
Well, keep in mind this PRISM program, and it should be clarified, most or all of these companies involved have denied that the government is plugging directly into their servers. So whether they're not on the level or whether maybe that story was a little off the mark, we'll find out. But the PRISM program, looking at what people are doing online, that is, according to what we've been told, simply foreigners essentially communicating with each other, not U.S. citizens.
Actually, I'm sorry, but James, the Washington Post said, deep into that story, because I read every word of it, said, wait a minute, said, while they are focusing on foreigners, that millions of Americans nonetheless are included.
I understand what the Washington Post has said. I'm saying what the government has said to this point is that we're talking about foreigners communicating with each other. So the question is, if someone in Pakistan is communicating with someone else in Pakistan, but that communication is going through a server in the United States, does it bother you if our intelligence community is able to see what they're talking about? Right. I think a lot of people would say no. Now, as far as the broader telephone issue, there's never a good time to trust big government, especially now seeing these IRS abuses. But I think we probably should take a breath here and understand we are a country with a lot of soft targets. We can't harden them all. Technology is an advantage we have over terrorists. You don't want to give the government carte blanche to spy on all of us, but if it's a program where it allows them to look for that needle in the haystack and find the bad guy, you want that as long as they're not, as long as you're sure with the rest of that haystack they're not abusing his privileges.
And therein lies the problem because, you know, in terms of the rest of that haystack, I just wonder whether some of my day is going to trickle over to the RRS. Colonel Leighton, I remember the Clipper chip controversy of the 1990s. Government wanted to install a little doorway into every chip in every device. Now, that got shouted down within a few years, never heard of again. Then after 9/11, now we're just going willy-nilly and going way too far. Why can't you guys at the NSA, where you used to work, instead of putting out a 50,000-mile wide gill net and bringing all the fish in and then looking to see whether any fish are interesting, why can't you first come up with a suspect, like, say, the Tsarnaev brothers in Boston, and then after you have a fish, then you go to all of those other intrusions? Why start with so wide a net?
Well, part of the problem is that, you know, once you have a wide net, you can then cull things down. So in order to go after someone like the Tsarnaev brothers, which obviously didn't work in time in the case of the Boston bombings,
bingo.
What you have to do is you have to, you know, find who possibly could be of a suspicious nature. And because our laws are written the way they are, you cannot say, okay, everybody is guilty of a crime until they're proven innocent. That just doesn't work with our legal system. So in this particular situation, where you have a requirement for data, they cast the net wide so that they can actually find those needles in a haystack, as James mentioned, because that is the only way that you can get as many of the needles as possible. You're not going to get all of them, but you at least have a higher likelihood of getting them if you cast a wide net. So then it becomes a question of privacy versus public safety, and that is really what the essence of this debate is all about.
James, I don't. The problem is this wide net isn't catching anything yet. I mean, aren't we just overwhelmed by so much data?
It is catching some things. And in this city, obviously in New York, we're sensitive for obvious reasons. We remain the #1 target. We have a police department in this city that is very aggressive within the law at gathering information, at surveillance, you might call it. A lot of cameras. A lot of I guess to use the right term, checking in on people in legal ways that they're allowed to do. Now, we have not had another attack here. We know a lot of plots have been thwarted. There was this effort to blow up the Federal Reserve Bank in New York. So, so it's working in many areas.
The question in the end, though, is whether the techniques that gave them those tips were because it's electronic stuff like NSA is doing, or was it because of good old shoes on the ground and getting confidential informants and building sources? All right, we got to go. Thanks to both of you, gentlemen. Appreciate it.